So if you picture yourself stranded on a raft in the middle of the ocean, right, and you are just dying of thirst, your absolute first instinct is to drink the water around you.
Oh, yeah, of course. It's human nature.
Right, but seawater actually has a higher concentration of salt than your own body's cells. So if you drink it, instead of hydrating you, it aggressively draws water out of your cells. Dehydrates you faster, just fundamentally damaging your tissue from the inside out.
Exactly. It's a fatal mistake.
And today, we are looking at a huge stack of clinical guidelines and microbiome research that reveals why millions of women entering menopause are accidentally doing the exact same thing to their own bodies.
Yeah, they are. They're reaching for over-the-counter pharmacy treatments to get some relief from discomfort and inadvertently using products that literally suck the water out of their cellular tissue.
Welcome to today's deep dive. We are exploring a condition called genitourinary syndrome of menopause, or GSM. And this is something that affects up to 84% of postmenopausal women, yet it's barely talked about openly.
It is a massive blind spot in women's health. I mean, we are talking about a fundamental misunderstanding of the microscopic ecosystem of the pelvic region.
Yeah, and our core mission today, for you listening, is to answer one vital, overarching question that we found across all these sources. Can vaginal pH changes affect treatment comfort? Because the answer to that question completely rewrites the rules on how we handle this entire transition.
It really does, and I think we first have to look at how we even talk about this transition, because for decades, the medical community used terms like vulvovaginal atrophy or, atrophic vaginitis.
Which honestly sounds terrible. Atrophy makes it sound like an organ is just failing and withering away. It carries such a heavy stigma.
That stigma is exactly why the terminology was officially updated around 2014 to GSM. GSM is just a much more accurate umbrella term, right? Because it acknowledges that we aren't just looking at one isolated symptom like vaginal dryness. It's an entire interconnected system experiencing this chronic progressive syndrome. So GSM includes burning, irritation, dyspareunia, which is painful sexual intercourse, as well as urinary urgency and recurrent urinary tract infections.
Okay, so let's unpack this. To understand why those symptoms happen and why throwing a random pharmacy lubricant at the problem often backfires so badly, we really need to establish the baseline normal.
Right, the healthy state.
Exactly. The sources go deep into the biological chain reaction that maintains a healthy premenopausal environment. And from what I'm seeing, it all basically starts with estrogen.
Yeah, estrogen is essentially the fuel source for the entire urogenital system during reproductive years. It maintains the thickness and, the elasticity of the vaginal lining, but more importantly, it stimulates the epithelial cells. Those are the cells lining the tissue to produce and store a complex sugar called glycogen.
Wait, so the body's just stockpiling sugar directly in the walls of the tissue?
Yes, but not for its own energy. That glycogen is actually the preferred food source for the native protective bacteria in the vaginal microbiome, specifically a genus called Lactobacillus.
Okay, I like to think of this relationship a bit like maintaining a sourdough starter in your kitchen.
Well, that's a good analogy.
Right. If you want the good yeast and bacteria in a starter to thrive and keep the bad mold away, you have to constantly feed it flour and water. So in the human body, the estrogen signals the body to provide the sugar, and the lactobacilli just gorge on it.
And just like fermentation in your kitchen, these lactobacilli consume the glycogen and produce a byproduct, which is lactic acid. That constant, localized production of lactic acid keeps the vaginal pH highly acidic. It typically hovers between 3.8 and 4.5.
Which is pretty acidic.
Very. And this low pH is an incredible evolutionary defense mechanism. Pathogens simply cannot survive in that highly acidic environment.
Okay, but then the menopause transition begins. The estrogen levels drop. And keeping with the sourdough analogy, you've essentially just stopped feeding your starter.
Exactly. The whole ecosystem collapses. I mean, without estrogen, the epithelial cells thin out and they start producing that crucial glycogen. So the food source vanishes and the lactobacilli literally starve.
Wow.
As their populations plummet, the lactic acid production just grinds to a halt. The immediate consequence of that is the vaginal pH inevitably rises. It pushes above 5.0 and becomes much more alkaline.
And the sources categorize this bacterial shift into something called community state types, or CSTs.
Yeah, this is where the microbiology gets really fascinating.
Let's dive into the mechanics of how this, microscopic neighborhood actually changes?
So microbiologists map this out very clearly. Pre-menopause, a healthy environment is dominated by CSTI or CST2. These are the protective states, heavily populated by bacteria like Lactobacillus crispatus and Lactobacillus gasseri. They are essentially the guardians.
Right.
But post-menopause, as that pH rises and the environment becomes alkaline, it often transitions into CSTV.
The bad neighborhood.
Highly problematic neighborhood. CSTIV is characterized by a severe lack of lactobacilli and a massive overgrowth of diverse, harmful anaerobic bacteria, meaning they don't need oxygen to survive.
Oh, I see.
Yeah, we see a rise in genera like Gardnerella, Prevotella, and Bacteroids. And rather than producing protective lactic acid, these bacteria secrete enzymes that actively degrade the protective mucus layer of the tissue.
This sounds incredibly destructive. But looking at the actual physical symptoms women experience, the recurrent UPIs, the severe burning, is this pH shift the actual root cause of those symptoms, or is it just a side effect of the tissue getting thinner as we age?
Oh no, it is a direct causal driver. That alkaline shift, combined with the loss of the protective mucus layer, leaves the door wide open. External pathogens, particularly E. coli from the gut, can easily migrate, colonize, and thrive in the urinary tract simply because the acidic defense system is gone. That is the direct mechanical cause of the recurrent UTIs. And on top of that, the byproducts of those anaerobic bacteria in CSTIV create local chronic inflammation. That inflammation is what directly causes the burning sensation and accelerates the tissue damage.
Okay, so the ecosystem has gone from this highly acidic, self-cleaning environment to this fragile alkaline state filled with inflammatory bacteria, which brings us right back to the raft in the ocean.
Right, the hydration problem.
Because here's where it gets really interesting. The most logical instinct for someone experiencing this severe dryness and burning is to just go to the pharmacy and buy an over-the-counter moisturizer or lubricant, right?
And this is exactly where we run into the treatment trap. Because many of the standard water-based or glycerin-containing lubricants that line store shelves are actually toxic to this altered menopausal tissue. It all comes down to a physical property called osmolality.
Osmolality being the concentration of dissolved particles like sugars, salts, glycerin, or propylene glycol inside a fluid.
Exactly like your ocean water example from the start. Healthy physiologic vaginal secretions have an osmolality around, say, 280 to 310 millismoles per kilogram. But many commercial products have an osmolality of 2,000 to 6,000.
Wait, 6,000? That's insane. Which means when you apply that hyperosmolar product to tissue that is already fragile and thinned out from a lack of estrogen, the sheer physics of osmosis takes over.
Yep.
The high concentration of particles in the lubricant aggressively pulls the water out of the delicate epithelial cells to try and balance the equation.
The cells are completely drained, they shrivel, dehydrate, and eventually die. This leads to what the clinical literature calls severe epithelial toxicity and microtrauma. You are literally creating microscopic wounds in the tissue.
And the sources layer the pH issue right on top of this. We just established that someone with GSM often has an elevated alkaline pH above 5.0. If she unknowingly buys a moisturizer that is also alkaline or neutral,
she is heavily reinforcing the bad neighborhood. Applying an alkaline product further suppresses any surviving lactobacilli. It creates an absolute paradise for yeast and those harmful anaerobic bacteria like Gardnerella to just bloom.
oh my God.
So consider the cascade here. The patient uses a product to relieve dryness and burning. The product aggressively dehydrates her cells, causing microtrauma, while simultaneously promoting a bacterial infection. The treatment itself makes the condition exponentially more painful.
Which perfectly answers our core question. Yes, vaginal pH and osmolality absolutely dictate treatment comfort.
Yeah.
So if the pharmacy shelf is a minefield, what are the actual guidelines for finding something that, actually helps?
Well, the World Health Organization has very specific parameters. Any product used vaginally must have an osmolality below 1,200, though ideally it should mimic the natural 280 to 310 range. We call this isoosmolar.
Isoosmol, got it.
And crucially, it must also have a physiologic acidic pH between 3.5 and 5.0.
So an isoosmolar, acidic moisturizer, hydrates the tissue without ripping water out of the cells, and it artificially provides the acidic environment that pathogens hate.
Precisely.
But that just manages the daily symptoms, right? I mean, if the overarching problem is a lack of glycogen, a moisturizer can't force the body to start producing sugar again.
No, it can't. Non-hormonal treatments cannot reverse the underlying structural changes. To restore the original ecosystem and fix the root cause, you have to look at hormonal and bacterial interventions. The gold standard for moderate to severe GSM is actually local vaginal estrogen therapy.
Right, and this comes in creams, very small tablets like Vagifem or flexible rings. And the mechanics of it are fascinating because you aren't just soothing the tissue, you are literally kicking the dominoes back over.
Yeah, by reintroducing a very low dose of estrogen directly to the local tissue, the epithelial cells respond by thickening and, most importantly, they start producing glycogen again.
Your sourdough starter gets its flour back.
Exactly. The native lactobacilli gorge on the glycogen, they rapidly multiply, they pump out lactic acid, and the pH plummets back down to those healthy, protective, premenopausal levels.
But the moment you bring up estrogen therapy, a significant portion of people will immediately tense up. There is a deep, historically ingrained fear of hormones, largely tied to concerns about breast cancer or systemic risks like blood clots or strokes.
Which is completely understandable given the history of hormone replacement therapy.
Does using this local therapy expose the rest of the body to those risks?
It is a vital distinction to make because the clinical data on local vaginal estrogen is extremely reassuring. Because it is applied locally at such microdoses, the systemic absorption is minimal.
Meaning it isn't like flooding the bloodstream and traveling to the heart or the breasts?
Right. Pharmacokinetic studies consistently show that the blood levels of estradiol in women using these local treatments remain well within the normal baseline ranges expected in postmenopausal women who aren't on any therapy at all. It is so targeted that, unlike oral systemic estrogen, women generally don't even need to take progesterone alongside it to protect their uterine lining. It just stays where you put it.
That targeted approach makes total sense, but the sources also highlight a completely different angle of attack, which is the probiotic frontier.
This is such an exciting area of research.
We are used to seeing probiotics marketed for gut health, but researchers are actively running trials combining estrogen with specific strains of bacteria, or even using oral probiotics to treat GSM. Now, let me stop right there because that sounds impossible. How does swallowing a probiotic pill change the bacterial landscape of an entirely different organ system down in the pelvis?
It sounds like science fiction, honestly, but it just highlights the physical interconnectedness of our microbiomes. Specific oral strains like Lactobacillus rhamnosus GR1 and Lactobacillus reuteri RC14 have been proven in clinical trials to survive the digestive tract, exit the body, and physically migrate across the perineum to colonize the urogenital tract.
Wait, so it's literally a microscopic highway from one system to the other.
A direct pathway. And once they arrive, they help recolonize the vagina with protective bacteria, they produce lactic acid, and significantly improve GSM symptoms, especially when used alongside hormone therapy to ensure there is, glycogen waiting for them when they arrive.
That is wild. Now, we should acknowledge that some people might need different pathways entirely, perhaps because they just don't respond well to local estrogen. The FDA has approved alternatives for treating the severe pain of dyspareunia. One is a DHEA insert, also known as prasterone, and another is an oral medication called ospemifene.
DHEA is really fascinating because it is an endogenous steroid, basically a precursor hormone. When you insert it locally, the vaginal tissue uses specific enzymes to convert that DHEA into active estrogens and androgens right there inside the cells. It improves the tissue architecture without raising systemic hormone levels.
And ospemifene operates on a totally different logic. The sources call it a SERM, a selective estrogen receptor modulator. Let's slow down and unpack that. How does a single pill know to act like estrogen in the vagina, but not act like estrogen in the breast tissue?
Think of a SERM as a chemical skeleton key. Estrogen receptors in the body aren't all identical, right? The receptors in breast tissue have a slightly different cellular environment or lock shape than the receptors in the vaginal tissue.
Okay.
So ospemifene is designed to only turn the lock in the vaginal tissue. It triggers the cells to thicken and decrease pH, acting just like estrogen. But when it encounters the receptors in the breast, the key doesn't turn the lock. In fact, it can block the lock, acting as an anti-estrogen.
So you get the localized benefits without the systemic estrogen risks. But this brings up a crucial demographic, right? Women who absolutely cannot or simply do not want to use chemical or hormonal interventions of any kind.
Right. For example, breast cancer survivors.
Exactly. People who might be on strict estrogen-blocking medications and are just exhausted by the daily routine of applying moisturizers. If hormones and SERMs are off the table and over-the-counter moisturizers are often hyperosmolar traps, how do you physically change the tissue? The sources point to energy-based devices.
This is a massive, highly debated topic in the treatment of GSM. We're talking about the use of lasers, specifically fractional CO2 and erbium YAG lasers.
Now, I usually associate fractionally CO2 lasers with cosmetic dermatology, like facelifts, reducing wrinkles, that sort of thing. What is a laser actually doing to the internal vaginal wall?
The mechanism is remarkably similar to anti-aging treatments on the face, actually. A specialized wand emits laser energy to create microscopic thermal injuries, basically thousands of tiny, controlled burns along the vaginal epithelium.
Ouch.
Well, this provokes a massive healing response from the body. It stimulates fibroblasts, which are the cells responsible for generating new collagen. This process is called neocollagenesis. It also promotes the growth of new blood vessels, flooding the area with nutrients and attempting to restore elasticity.
And looking at the stack of sources, the initial observational studies look astonishing. Patients reported up to 92% satisfaction at 6 months. They measured significant drops in vaginal pH, major reductions in pain during intercourse, and noticeably restored elasticity.
Yeah, the observational open-label data look like a miracle cure. But if we connect this to the bigger picture, this is where we have to be incredibly careful about how we interpret medical data. Because when researchers move from observational studies to rigorous, sham-controlled randomized trials, the picture changed dramatically.
Wait, a sham-controlled trial being the ultimate test of the placebo effect, right?
Mhm.
Where one group gets the actual thermal laser burns, and the control group gets a fake procedure. Like the wand goes in, the machine makes all the laser noises, but absolutely zero energy is delivered.
Precisely. Organizations like NICE, the National Institute for Health and Care Excellence in the UK, reviewed these sham-controlled trials and found a startling discrepancy. The rigorous trials showed mixed, or at best, very modest long-term effects. In one major trial, while short-term vaginal dryness seemed to improve, other GSM symptoms like urinary leakage entirely returned over time.
Wait, seriously? So in some metrics, the women receiving the fake laser treatment improved almost as much as the women whose tissue was actually being burned.
They did. It highlights the profound power of the brain-body connection, particularly regarding sexual pain and the anticipation of relief. But beyond the debate over efficacy, there is a very serious debate about safety.
Yeah, the sources show a huge split in the medical community here. We have to report this impartially, but it's striking. The European Urogynecological Association generally considers these laser devices to be a safe therapeutic option.
But the FDA in the United States took a much harder stance. In 2018, they issued strong warnings regarding these vaginal rejuvenation devices. They highlighted significant, severe risks reported by patients, including scarring, deep tissue burns, and ironically, a worsening of dyspareunia.
Oh, wow.
Yeah, meaning the procedure caused the very chronic pain it was meant to cure.
It is the absolute definition of a developing frontier in medicine. I mean, the underlying concept of neocollagenesis makes biological sense,
Yeah.
but we are clearly still figuring out the long-term consequences of repeatedly inflicting thermal burns and potential scarring on already fragile tissue. It clearly isn't a first-line treatment for everyone.
Absolutely not. Anyone considering energy-based devices needs to have a very frank discussion with their provider about the lack of long-term rigorous safety data. It should be weighed very carefully against other proven options.
We have covered an immense amount of ground today, moving from the microscopic actions of sugar-eating bacteria to the thermodynamics of surgical lasers. Let's pull this all together.
The major takeaway is that genitourinary syndrome of menopause is not just dryness. It is a chronic, progressive condition driven by a domino effect. The loss of estrogen starves the protective lactobacilli of their glycogen.
Right.
And without those bacteria producing lactic acid, the vaginal pH shifts from a protective, acidic fortress to a vulnerable alkaline environment.
And that single pH shift is the master switch. It dictates everything from your daily comfort to your susceptibility to urinary tract infections. Crucially, it dictates whether the treatment you buy at the pharmacy will help you or actively harm you.
So, what does this all mean for you listening? If there is one practical action to take from this research, it is to become a relentless label reader. When you are looking for non-hormonal relief, avoid the hyperosmolar glycerin traps.
Read those labels.
Demand iso-osmolar products with an osmolality around 300 that are specifically pH balanced to the acidic range of 3.5 to 4.5.
And further, don't let historical fears stop you from discussing local estrogen with a doctor. It is a highly targeted fix that treats the root biological cause without acting as a systemic hormone overhaul.
Exactly. You know, the more we study GSM, the more we realize that our human cells are deeply, inextricably intertwined with our bacterial passenger.
Which leads to one final, completely mind-bending thought from the research to leave you with.
Yeah.
We spent this whole deep dive establishing that human hormones dictate the behavior of the microbiome, right? Estrogen feeds the bacteria. But the latest microbiome research suggests this is actually a two-way street. The vaginal microbiome might actively metabolize hormones locally.
It completely flips the traditional paradigm. It suggests our microbes aren't just passive residents waiting for our hormones to act. They might be active managers, literally influencing how estrogen and progesterone behave and are absorbed within the tissue itself.
Which makes you wonder, if our microscopic bacteria are actually helping to shape and regulate our hormones, could the future of menopause treatment move away from just replacing human hormones in a lab and instead focus entirely on cultivating and planting the bacterial gardens that manage them naturally? It turns out, whether you're looking at a sourdough starter on your counter or the hidden microscopic ecosystems inside the human body, the rules of biology are absolute. You have to balance the environment, provide the right fuel, and feed the good guys, or the whole system collapses. Thanks for joining us on this deep dive. We'll catch you next time.